This is wonderful, and I'm waving back. I'm really sorry about the video. Murphy, how he always acts, but I kind of still look like this. So just imagine it, and maybe we'll get the video to work later on. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to go to the slides and change that to presentation mode. And I think you see McEllery very small there. So that's better. Okay. Wait, I hear myself very strong in an echo. How can we? Yeah. Exactly. You will wave and then you will switch the mic on again if you want to talk to me. Okay, perfect. Um, okay, so this is really a talk with a title that McEllery proposed, and I want to thank him also for that title, and him and the whole team, because there's so many assumptions in that title. There is AI, there is ethical AI, there is a hype. And so I thought this is a nice homework to try to work that out. And I was looking hard for a visualization and found the cheesiest one. And this is really the subtitle of the talk, that we shouldn't be cheesy about that. First, a point of concerning where you can find these slides and all other materials that I'm referring to later on. This is my webpage, and I usually post-process slides, so I have all the references in order, and everything is hyperlinked. So it's probably going to be tomorrow, but you can find everything on that webpage then. Okay, so first, what is this about? What do we do these days when we want to know what something is about? We ask Google. Okay, AI ethics seems to be something with lots of guidelines, initiatives, conferences, but there's also jobs and so on and so forth. In data science and ethics, we also have codes, frameworks, podcasts, books, checklists, and so on. And privacy would be one of the typically highlighted topics there. And whatever we do, we find several million results. We also have funding bodies becoming very active, such as the European Union saying we want to have ethics advisors and ethics advisory boards in every funded project now. And I think it's very interesting. I am in such a role with respect to one big project in the EU, and to see that the European Commission sees that as fulfilling its obligation to help avoid public uneasiness towards science and to mitigate concerns where they exist. You probably have that in your countries too. Similar things, and I'd love to talk more about that. But this doesn't yet really tell us what ethics is about, or AI and ethics is about. So I'm going to the second kind of motivational method, which is to ask you. And I want to thank Jacob very much for making this little survey and for sending me a ton of results yesterday morning. And so what I did in a kind of suicide commando is to take all your questions and organize them into categories and try to say, do I have anything to say about that? And mind you, I did that yesterday. And so this is very much a just-in-time fixing of the talk. But thanks for the great questions. So I think I have three big kind of groups of themes. And the first I would call themes I plan to talk about a lot today. And so some of these questions that you posed concern the scope of ethics and about specific ethical judgments. There were a lot of questions about democracy and power and how you can be good or ethical for everybody, so let's call that the common good. There were questions about research ethics, scientific clarity and scientific practice, and of course about the term hype itself. And I don't know whether you can actually read all these things. I'm going to come back to some of the questions in the talk later. But what you may see if you're sitting in the first row is that some of these questions are in normal font and some are in italics. And the normal font were the answers to Jacob's question, what do you think are the most important questions concerning AI ethics today? So the first question. And the things in italics were the last question. What would you like Bettina to address? And I just grouped them together, but showed them in different fonts to make clear that there were more or less direct questions. And of course, the hype questions were all to me, for example. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that in slightly different order, but you will find these groups of questions, and I will come back to individual questions as well. If anything else arises, any other questions, of course, please raise your hand. Please let my gallery know, and he's going to be my eyes, and he's going to be your voice. There is the mic I hear. So we're going to get interaction going here. Okay, then there's a second group, which I'm sure you cannot read because that is 8-point font, which you should never put on your slides, but I highlighted the category names. And these are things that, contrary to what I would do normally, I will only talk about briefly today, because I think they are very specific and very big questions that we should address, that we can address without talking about ethics in general, but that I don't want to just, subsume under this big umbrella term. And so I will talk about the importance of rights and of laws and of regulation, but very little about specific laws and specific regulation. I will talk about biases, fairness and unfairness, and inequality, which was really a big block of questions from you. I will briefly touch upon issues related to consent, privacy, and data protection, and the question of accountability. Okay, and then there's a third group of questions from you themes that I will at most mention. And I would say this is really because I don't know enough about that. So there were some questions about human life, labor, or implications of AI on the labor market, then machine ethics and related questions, meaning if we have this super intelligent general artificial intelligence, is it going to be conscious? Is it going to be capable of making ethical decisions by itself? Should AIs have rights, and so on and so forth. I have a fairly, let's say, strict interpretation of things there. I always call upon people first when we talk about ethics, and I have lots of doubts about the existence of machine ethics at all. So that's of course a point for discussion, but it's a choice I'm making, and I'm calling on us to act ethically and think about how we're dealing with the AIs that we create. Then there is some technical questions about AI that were really needed to ask further question about, that artificial intelligence's ethical dimension. So, what is the current state of research in the field, or how far has the development of autonomous weapons gone? And then, if we answer that, then we can go and talk about ethics. Again, this is a whole different talk, so I'm not going to do that. Then there's things I don't believe in, which is AI that supersedes human intelligence and the singularity. Again, please argue with me on that. And then there was a question that I simply didn't understand. Again, send me email if you want to pursue this question. Okay, so let's hope I cover lots of these areas in some interesting ways to you. And I want to continue with something that from a social science viewpoint we would call positioning, which is at the same time a caveat and an invitation to you. So positioning means, where do I stand? From which point do I say what I'm saying? And I realized yet again that even all my case studies and my thinking, of course, are very centric to where I come from. You know, I am German, so that brings a whole lot of cultural and historical baggage with it. I live in the EU, which means I'm referring a lot to case studies and laws from the EU and conceptualizations of things such as privacy and data protection and fairness. And there is some US and Canadian thinking because I've worked with people from these countries on issues of AI ethics. And that means I'm ignoring something very, very big and very important for MLSS, and something that McGallery called AI for Africa many years ago in a talk that really impressed me a lot. I think it would be nice if I were able to say more about this, given that MLSS is in Africa, but I'm not. I need to learn from you. And I have heard yesterday that there is this wide range of backgrounds in the summer school. And I think that's super cool. Especially in a sense, the geographic width of background is something that's very specific and very special for this school. So again, send me thoughts, send me case studies, send me notes about laws, and so on. Okay. Yeah, so there was something else I wanted to say in relation to this slide. Some of you ask, how can we get the social scientists to the table? You know, they realized we need to do this thinking about how to be ethical as an AI person, how to do good as an AI person in an interdisciplinary way. And I completely agree. And you know what? It's not that hard. Social scientists are thrilled to work with us. They are thrilled for a whole host of reasons. But like us, they want to be taken seriously. So, if someone approaches you as a computer scientist and says, I'd like to work with you on my project, and could you please program the website? Then most of the time you're going to be a bit taken aback, because you're just going to be the servant, in a sense, who has some specific skills and who should stay in their place and not ask too many hard questions. And social scientists are exactly the same. They want to be taken seriously. They don't want to be the ones that tell you, oh, is this okay ethically, or is this okay legally? So show genuine concern, show genuine interest, talk to people and listen to them, and you will have an interdisciplinary collaboration going. It's not easy. You still have to continue to listen quite a lot, but it's the most mind-expanding and very often fun thing to do. So some of the examples here will be from interdisciplinary projects, and I hope that gives you some indication of how we're going about that. And so with all these preambles in the back of our head, I want to go into the main part of the talk, which has two big parts. The first is a bit about what's ethics, and the second is what's hype, or what's the hype about that. And then all these other topics will find their place in these big parts. So what is ethics at all? This fuzzy term, it's somehow about doing good. But what does that mean? So I'd like to take you through a case study. this is not machine learning, but it's data science. And we'll get to the machine learning in due time. So this is two photos of members of the Havasupai people, a small isolated tribe living in Arizona in the Grand Canyon in the US. And in 1990, some researchers approached them to get blood samples for diabetes research, because diabetes was really a big, big problem for this tribe. And there was hopes that they might find some genetic clues as to how this works. And maybe some of you who are doing machine learning know this Pima Indians data set. That's kind of the general context where this was born. So there was a hope, we did something for the Pima tribe. Can we do something for the Havasupai? Consent was obtained. Some of you mentioned the importance of consent when you get data from people. And then in 2000, nothing really came of that diabetes research, and it kind of, just went to sleep, the whole project. And then in 2003, a tribe member happened to stumble into a university room where a PhD presentation was going on. And they learned that these data, these DNA samples, and the data created from them, had been reused for finding and substantiating theories about the tribe's ancestors, where they came from, how their kinship structures are, etc. It sounds very nice and very, unharmful, but actually what people did find out was, say, we believe that this tribe actually migrated from Asia in ancient times, and we believe that most of the people in this tribe are very closely related to each other. In other words, they had babies with their cousins and, maybe even more closely related family members. The problem is that these two groups of insights were extremely offensive to the tribe. Why? Because there was let's say, the central belief that deities had put the tribe into where they lived at this moment, or where they live even now in the Grand Canyon. And of course, that's not only some people may say religious hocus pocus, but this is identity. And in the US, it has a lot of repercussions on land rights and what you can and cannot do. And of course, any society has these bans on incest, and the Havasupai have that as well. So they didn't really want to hear, hey, we're all kind of having babies with each other and with our family. And so this whole thing was considered deeply offensive, and they issued what is the worst thing that is provided for in the culture of the tribe, a banishment order for the University of Arizona, for everybody from the University of Arizona. You cannot come on our land anymore. A huge legal battle ensued. And after 7 years and nearly $2 million in legal fees, the university agreed to pay $700,000 to the tribe, and the samples were destroyed. In a big ceremony, which you see here on the top right, that at least brought peace to that aspect of the data collection. And in interviews, the geneticist was saying, I was doing good science. So she thought, I'm being ethical here. And the claim was, those judging me or those judging her as non-ethical failed to understand the fundamental nature of genetic research, where progress often occurs from studies that do not appear to bear directly on a particular disease. In other words, the data mining conundrum, you never know what data are good for, and therefore, collect data and reuse them when you find a good use for them. And this is actually bringing progress to mankind. And then there's another quote, and all these things in italics on these slides now are quotes. It has since been claimed that the scientific study of native Northern American genomes has been hampered due to scientists' fear of getting caught up in a similar legal predicament. So there is this entity all of a sudden, the scientific study of something, which is a good thing, which scientists have to do, and which scientists have a right to, and now they're being hampered by fears. So in a sense, what you see here very clearly is what people think is good and what people think is ethical can completely diverge between different, let's call them stakeholders, involved in such a scientific undertaking. And of course, here, if it's about personal data, people whose personal data this is, and scientists are two groups of stakeholders, by no means the only ones. Okay, so the take-home message here, number one, is acting ethically means doing good, but good is not a well-defined concept. And you should identify stakeholders, and you have to learn about their notions of good and bad, and you will learn, and you will have to relearn, and you will make mistakes. So let's say you find, and you will make mistakes, and you will have to relearn because there are dilemmas, and dilemmas are a very, let's say, inherent feature of any ethical thinking. So let's say you are faced with that dilemma, and really ask yourself if your data science project may help cure diabetes for, let's say, 800 people, but it may reveal incest and inbreeding considered a deadly sin in some families, let's say 40 people. Would you do it? So Meg Ellery is going to be my eyes. Just raise your hands if you, for the yes and then for the no, and you're going to tell me what the majority relationships are.
Okay, so all those in favor of the yes. Oh, it's difficult to count that. I think everyone must vote at least. What is that number? Go again? So a little bit less than half, I guess. Or and those in favor of the no? That's even less. Less than half. And those who abstained? So about 2. Okay, and then there's, I don't know what the rest do. Okay, so Bettina, it seems that the yeses are more about less than half. The no's are even less than that, I would say 10, 20%, and then abstain too.
Okay.
That was at least easy for me to count.
Okay, thank you very much. So what do we learn from that? And this is not the right and wrong thing. You know, this is not that the half of the audience were right and the quarter were wrong and the abstainers were even more wrong. It shows that the half of the audience, the ones who said yes, applied a certain kind of ethical judgment. We could say they compared the benefit for these 800 with the damage for these 40. And they did a weighting there. And the net outcome turned out to be positive for them. So they said, if the net sum of happiness that I can bring to the world with my data science project is positive, then I should do it. The others had some other reasons, and it was probably something about, well, you shouldn't harm someone. You just shouldn't, no matter how much happiness you bring to the world with that. And that's a different type of ethical approach, which is just as valid. The abstainers, I think, have a little bit of a problem or a challenge in that you're gonna come to these situations, decision situations. There was a while ago a survey on KD Nuggets to say how many data scientists deal with personal data, just as an example. And it turned out in a real job with at least 80% probability, you will be dealing with such data that actually bring you into dilemmas. And so, yeah, you can say, I don't know, but at some point, sooner or later, you're going to have to make such choices. And, well, not making a choice means choosing another job. So you may want to think more about this in the future. Okay, but we'll come back to even more difficult decision situations. So let's say, and this is the question maybe for the yeses particularly, if your data science project, again, has all these benefits for 800 people, but it may reveal that your best friend's father is not their biological father, or that they had a baby with a cousin, what does that change your judgment?
So again, the yeses. Okay,
So
now there's definitely
and the yeses who's now no.
Yeah, there's now more yeses than the previous time. And then the no's. The no's they are definitely now less. I think it's a handful. And are there people who want to say they abstain? Again, one. Okay, so Bettina, so this time it seems that there's definitely more yeses. I would say slightly more than half.
Okay.
Yes.
That's very, very interesting. First time I've gotten this result. And I'd love to talk to you individually about your motivations for that. But the point I was trying to bring home here is that there's I'm bringing in another aspect, also reflecting a large school of thought in ethical approaches, that the concrete relationship we have with someone who is affected by a decision that we make, for example, as a scientist, the particular, let's say, power that we obtain over these people, or that the power relations that we're in with these people, and the personal knowledge that we have may actually change things. So I can summarize a little bit at this point. We've been talking very roughly about a kind of consequentialist or utilitarian type of ethical reasoning, which is you weigh the happiness or against the unhappiness, and if the net outcome is positive, you do it. There's the deontological school of thought, where saying you just shouldn't do certain things. And the ethics of care is a group of approaches saying we really shouldn't pretend that everybody is the same and we have the same relationships with everybody who may be affected by our decisions, but we are in very concrete relationships that are relationships of with power differentials with very concrete people, and that may change our ethical judgment. And so now is the time to show you photographs of people, many of whom are already dead, which is to say there is this huge, really thousands of year old history of thinking about these issues of how can we actually make these calculi of how can we add the happiness of some people with the unhappiness of some other people. And this is by no means new to the era that we're in now, where AI-related decisions have to be made. And I just want to highlight a few questions that you need to ask, like what determines the overall goodness or utility of your project or your undertaking in general? And what do you do then? Do you do like an average? So in other words, do you do a sum over all stakeholders of the happinesses and unhappinesses? Or do you say, well, we should do a max min, like we should maximize the happiness of the person who is actually worst off? And then who are we talking about at all? Just people in our city, in our country, in our continent, the whole mankind, also animals, also plants, maybe also AIs. So who are the, in a sense, stakeholders that we're aggregating over, and then do some way more, and why? And all of these questions really come to the fore when we compare the benefits for 800 people and the damage for 40 people. And I will come to one of the specific questions that one of you asked to show this as an example. So next question. Your data science project may help or save the lives of thousands of people. I'm upping the ante here. But 10 people will die. Will you do it?
May there is a quality thing. That's just a chance. Will means definitely.
Let's say it means death. Let's say not risk, but it means death.
So again, I guess we go here for the yeses again. Oh, there's a question first. Okay, so there's actually another question, Bettina, and that is, if the project is not done, does that mean thousands of people will actually die?
An interesting variation on the theme. The normal way in which this is posed is that it may the lives, but you could also have it in a version where if you don't do it, thousands of people die. But the point is, so your action has an effect on the lives of some people, and a positive effect on some people, and it has a clear negative effect on some other people.
Okay, so the yeses. Oh, there's another question before we go to vote. Yes? Okay, so now is there a question? Do we have a feel for the probability that the first or the second outcome will happen?
Yeah. I love you guys. You are like real computer scientists. You think that we can do a probability calculus here? Okay, if we could do this 100 times, and I could tell you how the outcomes were in each of these 100 things. The problem in real life is usually you can only do it once. So probabilities are very subjective here.
So let's go over to the voting. Those in favor of... okay, there's another question. Let's just get that. We're afraid. Yes? Okay, so here the question is how does the project actually work? Is the dying of the people happening like you kill them, or is the consequence of the project? Do I paraphrase it correctly? I would hope that it's just a consequence.
Okay. I think this is the time when I should go over to the concrete example to make this more concrete, and we defer voting.
Okay, let's go to voting quickly. Those in favor, yes? There is, it's probably 20, I guess, if I have to do a thumbs up. And no, the majority is no, so that I can say. It's probably more than half. And let's try just again the abstains. There's now definitely more abstains going on. Okay.
So this is a really hard thing, and this question hasn't been asked to you for or this is not the first time. This has been asked in a kind of democratic fashion. Again, what we see here is that this summing, of the happiness and unhappiness somehow doesn't seem to work very well anymore if the bad outcome is people dying. So there seems to be this threshold of some things are just not done. They are just not okay, no matter how much happiness outweighs it. And that's the idea of this deontological reasoning. McElroy covers Immanuel Kant, one of the big names in the ontological reasoning. There is also a picture of Philippa Foot, who, as far as I know, first came up with this so-called trolley problem, which we see in many variations these days. I showed you one on the previous slide, and you see the typical AI-related formulation on the bottom right of that slide, which is the self-driving car has the choice to kill the people on the left or on the right, and which people should it kill, essentially. So you may have seen this article that came out, I think, in December by Awad et al. In Nature about the so-called moral machine. So they basically varied 9 dimensions of these people who are going to get, or who may get killed by the self-driving car, and they asked that to tons of people in different countries and reported the results. There is a big thing to be said at this point. This moral machine experiment is a case of so-called descriptive ethics. Like, what are the judgments that people really do? When I ask you questions and McElroy takes the votes, of course, in a sense, that's what we're doing too. Normally, what we talk about when we say acting ethically is that we start from a prescriptive notion of where we're saying, how are we allowed or able to even think of what's right and wrong, regardless of how many people do that? And so what happens actually in the moral machine experiment, or when I'm asking you the question, in a sense, I'm triggering these 2 big lines of thinking: a utilitarian, consequentialist, meaning it matters what the outcome is, and deontological, meaning it matters whether the action in itself is right or wrong. And both of these are prescriptive, and I'm kind of asking you for your vision of that. So and I want to come back to some specific instantiations of this for AI on future slides. And there's also a little inlay on this slide that says terror. And Terror is a very interesting book that looked into this same kind of problem, where you weigh the lives of some people against the lives of some other people in the framework that was very much post 9/11. If terrorists have hijacked a plane and they threaten to drop this, a passenger plane, sorry, and they threaten to drop this into a football stadium with hundreds of thousands of people currently in attendance of a football match, would you be allowed to shoot down that plane in order to avoid this plane dropping and killing these hundreds of thousands of people? So if you shoot down that plane, you're going to kill the 200 or what people who are on that plane, and you may be avoiding the death of all these others. If you don't shoot down the plane, you also don't know what happens. So there is a lot of, in a sense, possibilities going on there in most of these scenarios. And actually, that happens with the self-driving cars as well. You know, nobody says the self-driving car should kill someone, but it's really about how do we organize the possibilities of, well, who should be killed in some sense. You could just as well not kill anyone. Okay, and right, so these are the slides I have to skip over because they basically say there is no way of you getting out of the responsibility of making such choices sometimes. And there is no way of you saying, oh, the ethics board will decide that. Ethical decision making is something we are all forced to do from time to time, sometimes very often. And the more impact our work has on society, which AI does and machine learning does, the more we'll probably be confronted with that. And this is just a call to, having and honing this personal responsibility. Okay, so now I'm going to skip over a lot of slides. And yeah, so this is just as a summary of this first part, the different approaches to ethical judgment. And now we could come back to one of the concrete questions that you asked me in Jacob's survey. Is it any less ethical to take away someone's livelihood by being replaced by an AI than allowing that AI to act maliciously in a non-physical harmful way towards that person until they lose their job? So let me rephrase this in a slightly more pointed way. You have two scenarios here that affect or that concern the labor market and AI's relationships to the labor market. And in one of the scenarios, well, you just design this wonderful robot or AI that does the job of this person, and so this person just, gets made redundant. No hard feelings. It's nothing personal. It's just that the robot is doing it better than you. And the other scenario is you build an AI that bullies the person. And in the end, they give up, and they lose their job. So in both cases, they lose their job. Okay. And now here's something that I think I have to be very clear about. An ethics professor, and I'm by no means an ethics professor, but I'm someone, talking about that, is not really, does not really have the role to tell you what's right and wrong, to tell you whether it's better or worse to have this smarter AI that makes the person lose their job, or the bully AI that makes the person lose their job. But the task of ethics is to help you to think of these things in a structured way and to realize what assumptions you're making. So we could say, and we could rephrase this question as another vote. We could say, which AI is the ethically better? The one who's the one that replaces the person, or the one that bullies the person? And is that better or worse? So if we think of it in the terms that we've seen so far, the outcome or the consequence is the same in both cases. The person loses their job. Okay? So if we weight the unhappiness of the person due to the loss of their job, there's absolutely no difference. Right? Okay, we abstract from the psychological unhappiness of being bullied. But if we go to a kind of deontological way of thinking about ethics, then we say there is this benevolent AI that just does the job better in scenario one, and there is the malicious AI, and you just shouldn't be malicious. You shouldn't bully people. And then, of course, in a sense, it would be more ethically good to have scenario 1 than scenario 2. And if we take other approaches to thinking about ethics, that's such as the ethics of care, I guess bullying would be a major theme when we talk about ethics of care and how we're actually in relationships of power. It's a good question. I think the ethics of care wouldn't say something concretely about this question because this is not about concrete people and the concrete relationships. It hints, the scenarios hint at this relationship that somebody has, a relationship with that job holder that allows them to bully them and to program the bullying and the effective bullying into the AI. But there isn't really a judgment that we can make very clearly. Okay, bottom line, there's different ways of thinking in a structured way about what is right and wrong, and this doesn't change whether what is affected or what is causative here is an AI or is machine learning or is data science. Okay, so let's go to another big topic here, which is how can we be good, not only good for some stakeholders that we may be weighting more strongly than others, how can we be good for all? And there's this, everybody wants that, right? I mean, look at any ethics code. Here, my favorite phrasing is always from the Asilomar Principles. Superintelligence should only be developed in the service of widely shared ethical ideals and for the benefit of all humanity rather than one state or organization. Shared benefit. AI technologies should benefit and empower as many people as possible. Shared prosperity. The economic prosperity created by AI should be shared broadly to benefit all of humanity. I can understand the motivation. Of course, we probably all have that because we would have to say just good is not enough because everything is good for someone. Otherwise, they wouldn't build that. Even a lethal autonomous weapon is good for someone. Otherwise, they wouldn't commission it. So lots of ethics codes talk about similar ideas of common good. And here I think we can step in, and that's what I've been doing in the article that I also hyperlinked on the abstract for the summer school. The common good is another of these ethical principles or concepts that people have been talking about for 2,000 years. So just some AI people coming and saying, oh, we want to be good for all, without realizing what the problems are when you're trying to go there, is honestly a bit naive. I mean, it's good that people try, but they should be thinking about well-known pitfalls. And so I looked at some of the huge literature on the common good from philosophy and political philosophy, and you run into very big questions very soon. So a very simple definition of the common good is that which benefits society as a whole. What's the that? So we need to go and define the that. We need to go and define the benefit. We need to go and define the society and the whole. So the that would be, in one definition, the relevant interests and facilities that serve these interests together constitute the common good and serve as a shared standpoint for political deliberation among members of a political community. Okay, so the interests are what is good, and the things with which we realize or protect these interests, so facilities. And the facilities could be a social institution, a right, a human right. And then if we look at dimensions and challenges for the common good, and we look at, what does this benefit mean? What is benefit a utilitarian concept? Like, oh, we just weigh the happinesses and the unhappinesses? Or are there certain things that just shouldn't be done? And who is the society that we're talking about? Do we maximize the happiness of people in Europe when we block all refugees coming into Europe? Do we maximize the happiness of people in the US if we build a wall to Mexico? Should we integrate larger swaths of mankind or humankind into that? Should we stop should we have grown-up people? Should we stop at people? Should we include wider classes of beings and so on? Then there's a very big and long discussion about, can we define the common good in a so-called substantive way? Like, can we say, this is good? It's good if everybody has a smartphone. Or should we say what the good is always a question of procedural deliberation? So in a sense, a more democratic idea of, we need to not say this is good and we want this, but we need to create structures and maintain structures and protect structures in which we can actually deliberate what we think is good. Then is something that's good for all always the same? Or do we have different interests? And how do we distribute these benefits then? So this communal versus distributive. And the interests and facilities, of course, what are they? And so just to give a little bit of a glimpse, what I derived from the history of philosophical thinking about the common good were 4 questions about AI that pretends or that claims to be for the common good. And I said, we have to look at what is the problem and what is the goal and who defines that, which is a little bit coming back to the case study of the Havasupai. What's the problem here? Is it scientific progress? Is it the respect for people? Is it the sense of identity? Who gets to define that? Which stakeholders? And how do we know who the stakeholders are at all? Then, and now the order gets reversed. The third question that I asked is to say, AI is certainly not an interest, but a facility, because it's engineering. And within that, I looked very much at the role of knowledge, and then at what are important side effects and dynamics. So that's a long paper, and it's too complicated to explain that here. But what I would like to highlight is, it was so interesting. I got a lot of flack from the reviewers, some of whom said, well, isn't all of that obvious? Yeah, you do ethical AI, and you know that different people have different notions of the problem, and you need to look at stakeholders and dynamics. Of course, we're cyberneticists. We know about dynamics and complex systems. La 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 la. And then I was prompted to do a reality check, and I looked at 4 big conferences recently held. That have titles such as AI for Good, Data Science for Social Good, AI for Social Good, AI for Common Good, whatever. And it was interesting. That was nearly 100 papers. Basically, all of them said, this is good. It's good if people cycle to work instead of driving the car. It's good if poultry farmers in Africa have information on chicken prices on the market. And so on and so forth. So it was all this substantive going on where the researcher and the data donors and the money donors say, this is good, and now we're going to do AI for good, which ignores the criticism of, hey, somebody thinks, somebody says this is good for all, that's just a very undemocratic thing to do. And every dictator in the history of mankind has argued from a substantive notion of the common good. What I'm doing is good for the people. So I found that a very interesting finding. Were alternative goals looked at? What is the problem and what is the goal? No. Were different stakeholders looked at, and where they described, their perspective describes, and their needs assessed? This is the second question. Did they talk about the role of knowledge? Did they talk about dynamics as good systems people? Nope. So, you had a very, very small number of papers that actually talked about these things, but most of the time it was, we, the researchers, and our funders know what's good, and now we're going to go for it with our brilliant AI, and then everybody's happy. So I think the reality check is these differentiated questions of how to do ethical reasoning at all, of how to integrate different stakeholders at all in order to get a democratically founded version of what is good AI and what is ethical AI, we're not doing that yet. And I have to say, maybe some of this is a consequence of the project and publishing culture that we're in. Because, the paper has to be done, and the funders must not be alienated. The people who gave us the data, if we say, well, what you want and what you think is good is actually not good at all, then they won't give us the data. So there is a lot of structural problems in the way we do science that actually make it difficult to act ethically and to reason ethically. And I think we must never forget that. Okay, so I'm going to ask you then another question about the self-driving cars. And by this, I'm criticizing my own, let's say, praise of democracy that I raised throughout. And this is from the conclusions of that moral machine experiment paper. Basically, what the author says is, we looked at ethical judgments of people all across the world, and in some countries, the preference was for killing younger people over older people, or vice versa, and we can link that to cultural norms that we know about these countries, and we can use the challenges of machine ethics as a unique opportunity to decide as a community what we believe to be right or wrong, and to make sure that machines, unlike humans, unerringly follow these moral preferences. We might not reach universal agreement. Even the strongest preferences expressed showed substantial cultural variation, and our project builds on a long tradition of investigating cultural variations in ethical judgments. Wow. Sure, this gets into nature. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that was the late 40s. That's so old, we need a version 2.0. And why don't we just crowdsource that? I know we can have a very big discussion about that, and I know we can't have that in the form of a very simple vote. So what I just want to say is this is a very naive embracing of a very simple idea of how democratic decisions work. And I put the word militant democracy into the title here. The problem about democracy is if you let people decide on everything, they may actually kill their own democracy very easily. And therefore, most of our state systems are built on something where the democratic element has like a checks and balances value system behind it, usually in a European setting or in a Western setting, that would be embodied in the Constitution. And militant democracy doesn't mean people all run around with guns. It means democracy must defend itself against killing itself by its own means. And so I really want you to think about this passage in the paper and think about the issues that this kind of embracing of referendum principle brings. So again, I really recommend this book, Terror, which actually this was built on a theater play, and they had a vote at the end as well, and the vote was always utilitarian. The outcome was always utilitarian. People preferred to have 200 passengers in that plane killed to the 200,000 in the stadium. And the book is in the shape of a fictitious court case where all different witnesses are being heard, and all the arguments of thousands of years of philosophical thinking about utilitarian and deontological ethics becomes very concrete, and it's really, really well done. So this is also out in English. And I really recommend to read that if you're into that moral machines stuff and self-driving cars that kill different types of people and so on. Okay, so before I go to the hype and the criticism, I just want to add a thought on why I'm not talking about discrimination today. So bias, unfairness, discrimination has received a lot of attention in the AI community. How can we change data sets that have the unfairness of the whole history baked into them? How can we change algorithms that make classifications or decisions so that they become more fair, and so on? And there were a lot of questions from you about that. And this has kept me busy for the better part of the last 10 years. But I have a very big issue with that whole, let's say, literature at the moment. And it's very well captured in something that a well-known law professor and activist once said. So he was asked, he was at a rally and he was beaten up by the police, and somebody asked him, was it unfair that you were beaten up by the police? And he went, it was unjust, but it wasn't unfair because everybody else was beaten up as well. I think there is this risk of a race to the bottom. If we just do the same horrible things to everybody, and we have fairness and equality, then everything's going to be good. And no, before we do that, we actually should be asking about what is unjust. And one of my pet examples for that, so this is from Latanya, this is from a classic article in the area that really brought that to attention by Latanya Sweeney, published in 2013. Latanya Sweeney is a professor at MIT, and she Googled her name. And then she got this ad. Looking for Latanya Sweeney? Check Latanya Sweeney's arrests. Wow. And Latanya Sweeney looks like this. So she thought, oh, interesting. Then she Googled for some more black-sounding first names. And she got the same result. And she Googled for some white-sounding first names, and there was no mention of to check the arrests. And she thought this is a big scandal because that's totally unfair and biased against black people, which, South Africa knows that problem too well, but the US knows that problem as well. And so that sparked a lot of understanding or a lot of discussion about, okay, what's going on here? Why does Google show me these ads? it probably shows me these ants because there was an association found in past data of people querying and people getting results and people clicking on results that had lots of bias in it by lots of people looking for arrests and prior criminal history of black people and less so for white people. And because in the US, first names are very indicative of ethnicity, that pattern arises, and a very benevolent algorithm, association rule learning essentially, turns into a totally biased thing because the data are biased. So somebody asked about the Norman AI from MIT. Norman is the first AI psychopath. And the idea is Norman learns from some horrible Reddit subreddit on, we don't want to know that. It's really, really horrible and tasteless and graphic and so on. And so he can, this AI can behave like a psychopath. And the whole idea there is also, well, in machine learning, we'll learn what you put in. And if the input is biased, then this is what you're going to get. And the whole unfairness thing very much centers on that. It's not only about biases in the data. There's also bias in algorithms and so on. And it's great work. But I really, really want to draw your attention to a feature that I think gets overlooked here. When I see that Google result as a European, I am actually scandalized, of course, by the bias against black people, but by the fact that you can actually look up people's arrests. So there's this huge bias against people who, for whatever reason, were in prison once, or who, for whatever reason, had some contact with the police. And that means the whole argument that Latanya makes, in a sense, takes for granted that they live in a society where that is okay, where it's okay to put that stamp of you've been in prison forever on a person. And that, I think, is an ethical decision that we also have to look at, and that therefore this, I believe, is a very unjust thing that such companies that allow you to look at somebody's arrest exist at all. So for me, the ethical reasoning is kind of predating the unfairness, and that's why I kept it so short today. Okay, so I will skip over these things as well and just say a few things now about hype, and then we can go into more discussion. Is that okay? 5 more minutes? Good. Yeah, so this is just what can we do, so I do believe there are ways of acting ethically as a data scientist, as an AI scientist. A big part of it is setting up ethics codes and setting up procedural best practice things. This is a short excerpt from something that Luc has already presented. Yeah. So you've seen Luc Derat, that this is something that's been created in our group for data management, and I think that makes a lot of sense. There is other approaches that we've described in a paper, namely this one, Somela and others that I invite you to read, that where we make more reference to specifically explicit ethical reasoning, in this case, ethics of care. And it's not a solution. We can say we try harder, and we have to keep that in mind. We cannot definitely solve social problems, whether there's AI in them or not. Okay, so hype. What is hype? I really wanted to know what does it mean, because we take that for granted so much. And I think the verb definition, promoting or publicizing something intensively, often exaggerating its benefits, maybe captures that feeling best that McAlery and his colleagues had when they asked me to talk about the AI hype, the AI ethics hype. And my answer here would be, I think it's good that we care about that. If we look into the history of science, lots of bad things happen in the name of science. And when often, after wars or after terrible catastrophes, scientists and others finally started thinking about the ethics of what they're doing, and they came to conclusions: we're not going to do certain things anymore. We're not going to do medical experimentation on people without consent, and so on and so forth. We're not going to use biological weapons. We're not going to use landmines and cluster munition, and then go into this long drawn process of getting countries to agree on that. That is a good thing. So in a sense, I believe you can't be too hypey if it's really about high stakes things. Okay, of course, the AI ethics hype. Why is AI ethics so much publicized? Because there is an AI hype at the moment. So there's a very nice series of articles in KD Nuggets on the different hype cycles in AI. And I think one of the risks, nope, I don't want that. One of the risks I see is that we often focus on fears and cool AI, and we neglect statistically much larger risks. So we're thinking of these super robots or that take our jobs, and we're not thinking of very dumb scheduling algorithms, very dumb robots that actually kill people on the factory floor. And we have to see this larger picture instead of just, thinking about superintelligence and then this superintelligence replacing all our jobs. Okay. What I also think is a problem is we're making assumptions in some of these scenarios that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So with the whole thing with that self-driving car, we're assuming the self-driving car has all the information about all the people it might kill or not kill, whether they're young or old and female or male and, whatever. And then it makes these decisions. Yes, that is a really big problem. But, when I drive a car and I try to brake in a dangerous situation, I don't make these decisions either. Okay, I can't because my brain isn't equipped to do that. But there are similar situations where we can have information, and we have come to the understanding as a society that we're not going to use this information, even if it could be useful. Very simple example, information that you've gotten based on torture methods is not applicable, admissible evidence in a court of law, even if it's true. And that's a pretty good deterrent to using that. And why not ban self-driving cars from using certain information so it doesn't have to make these decisions? Okay. There is another big problem, and this kind of goes back to the life or death, thousands of people versus 10 people. And of course, in a sense, an army makes such decisions a lot. You're weighing the lives of your own people versus those of the enemy. But then there is a lot of democratic, hopefully, structure and checks and balances regarding an army. But if we let an AI do that and its proprietary algorithms, then all of a sudden such decisions are made by non-democratically legitimized entities. Not the army, not the police, but a software company or the mythical, self-conscious, whatever, artificial intelligence itself. And that is, of course, very extreme if you take that to the scenario of autonomous weapons. But you have the same problems when you use artificial intelligence and data science proprietary algorithms in things such as predictive policing or whatever other decision situations. So I think we need to be very, very aware of the historical progress we've made to create decision structures, transparency structures, accountability structures, because of the well-known dangers of power and force and lethal force being misused if it can be done without checks and balances. Okay, and so a last thing here is that there is a big risk if we say ethics that we replace this whole system that we have that I referred to on the previous slide of a system of law, a system of constitutionally guaranteed rights, of enforceable rights by fuzzy warm feelings. And the really, really bad thing, many people have said, there is this tendency to talk about ethics in an undefined and unaccountable way. And ethics is what resides in the magnanimity of the one who does good, the scientist, the developer, the company. Whereas the law and regulation and human rights says everybody has rights, and they have a right towards the state to have these rights being protected. And so ethics is very often, I think, abused by, let's say, agents saying, we know what's good for you. So industry self-regulation argues a lot with ethics, because that kind of does away with the need for having laws that can be enforced. So the law should never be forgotten. Democratic structures should never be forgotten. They have baked into them a lot of bad experiences that we've had in the past. And ethics is not just a warm, fuzzy feeling, but is a very structured way of thinking about hard moral dilemmas. And this is where we should go. And so I'll end with that. So don't be cheesy, try harder. And we have processes. We have ethics processes, and we have software-related things such as software design patterns for such principles that can help us bridge that gap between the fuzziness and the law and our good intentions. But good intentions themselves aren't enough. Thank you very much, and I look forward to more questions.
Thanks, Bettina. I think we have time for a couple of questions. So are there any questions?
Thank you for that. That was very interesting. I was just wondering about the sort of reformation of like a new, you're talking about the Human Rights Act 2.0, and sort of taking into account AI, is there any bodies which are interesting to follow from a research perspective?
Did you get that?
Actually, I didn't. Can you repeat it?
So,
no. I think McAllery's mic is somewhat easier to understand for me.
Yes, I'll try. So the question is yes. Are there any bodies and research being done in this Human Rights Declaration 2.0 and how to take that further?
Okay, Human Rights 2.0 was a rhetorical thing I made up, okay? Now, seriously, can you just mute yourself for a sec?
Good.
Okay, seriously. Of course, ever since that unbelievable historical moment when such a huge share of humankind actually agreed on what is good and what we want, the discussion of what human rights are and how we should change them has been ongoing. And there has been a very, let's say, very strong pushes by some countries for having this culturally adapted human rights. I see that with great, and I don't want to name the countries now, okay, because that's just going to go into some pretty usual stuff, but I can send you more links on that. And often what we find is that there's a lot of politics going on there that if you look at it more closely, even if you look at it in terms of democratic structures, let's say just one example, protection, non-discrimination, bisexual orientation. There are countries that actually would like to enforce the homosexuality being a sin, and of course that's not compatible with the idea of human rights. If you look at these arguments more closely, very often they don't really stand. But it's, again, the people who do that research have a certain positioning, like we all do, and it's an incredibly difficult thing to do, but I think we have to keep trying, and the UN, for example, as a body, is trying to keep that discussion culture and that discussion forum alive, where everybody has to agree on certain minimal standards. And I'm just saying that we, as researchers and as AI people, we have to become much more attuned to these initiatives that have been going on and that are going on for a long time. For autonomous weapons, there's amazing communities and initiatives that have been doing great work for years and decades, just as an example. And we have to take that into consideration and to learn what political scientists and politicians have learned about decision structures and pitfalls over many, many years, instead of saying, oh, we have a new forum for becoming really democratic, and that is called Amazon Mechanical Turk, to say it in very, very black and white terms. So the crowdsourcing is very, let's say, has methodological issues such as self-selection. It is very influenceable by populistic arguments and so on. And I think I would like to leave it at that.
Do we have more questions? Oh, there's a question there at the back.
So in particular with self-driving cars or with the self-policing idea, why are people so uncomfortable with the fact that AIs make mistakes even if they make 1,000 times less mistakes than humans?
So I'll just repeat for you. So the question is I mean, with self-driving cars and self-policing, why are people so uncomfortable adopting these things if it can save that, I guess, many lives and stuff, but there is a risk that something can go wrong as well? Is it rightly paraphrased? Yeah, so AI is making 1,000 times less. Yeah, that's actually better. So if AI is making 1,000 times less mistakes than a human, yet we are so worried about the fact that it will make one mistake, but it, on average, there's many more mistakes being made by humans as opposed to being made by AI.
Yeah. God, I love your questions. All of them are really, really deep and complex. I think this again can be answered from different ethical standpoints. So we often hear that argument, okay, as you said, in a net way of looking at things, driving will become safer, probably. That would be a very utilitarian thing to do. You know, you do statistics over how many people die in traffic, and if it gets less, that's a good thing. We probably still feel extremely uncomfortable. We feel exposed and controlled. It would be the feeling, if a machine kills me, it didn't even try hard enough, or maybe it was misprogrammed, you know, something like that. A human would at least try to not kill somebody else. And if they do, they will bear the consequences their whole life. So I think there is a big thing about accountability here, which is one of the reasons I keep saying accountability. We need to look at accountability in established terms where there is a human being accountable at the end of the chain, because for accountability to work, you need to have sanctions if things go wrong, and you need to have sanctions that hurt people, that people are actually afraid of. And so a driver who has killed someone usually suffers all their lives. And so they will do everything they can to avoid that. A machine doesn't care. So I think there's also a big worry there that there is no incentive structure for the machine to really care about saving lives, human lives. And therefore, it could be too easily hacked, abused, and so on. Plus, this feeling a moral decision should simply not be taken by a machine that some people have. And I don't really have a good opinion about that. But I think there's a lot of these things that play into it.
So I think that we're out of time now. I'll try to turn this around, and then we thank Bettina again for this interesting talk. So thanks.
Thank you very much.